Thank you, John, for that kind introduction. And thanks to the Reagan Defense Forum for bringing together such a talented and dedicated group of people for these discussions. It is such a privilege to be among so many old friends and teachers and mentors and colleagues, fellow officers. Today, what I would like to talk with you about is about reclaiming America's strategic confidence. It is hard to imagine a more appropriate place to hold this discussion than this hall, a place that honors a leader who secured our nation, who helped bring down the Berlin Wall, and who ensured that freedom and liberty triumphed over communist totalitarianism. For those of us old enough, and it looks like most of us are old enough, this majestic building and its beautiful vistas evoke memories of when we learned the heartbreaking news of President Ronald Reagan's death. At the time, the news media, which was not always friendly to the president, struggled to handle that monumental event in American history. The American people showed us the way. More than 100,000 people came here to this library to pay their respects. It was reported that traffic was so congested approaching the library that mourners, anticipating an hour-and-a-half drive, remained in their cars for 6 hours, a long time even for people routinely subjected to Los Angeles traffic. A young man, Reagan Wilson, named for the president, told the New York Times that he had been very emotional in the wake of the president's death. The story of Reagan, he said, is the story of America, one of manifest destiny. Our founders believed that the greatest wisdom of our nation rests in the hearts and in the minds of the American people. President Reagan shared this belief, and we saw its undeniable truth in the days that followed his passing. When President Reagan took office in 1981, many believed that Washington was not serving the American people well. Our confidence at home and our influence abroad had waned significantly over the past decade. The Soviet Union appeared to be on the rise, and America, it seemed, was in decline. President Reagan ushered in a dramatic rethinking of America's role in the world and a dramatic renewal of American confidence. America would not only triumph in the Cold War and beyond, but reach a new height of influence and prosperity. He described, quote, a future of growth, opportunity, and security, anchored by the values of a people who are confident, compassionate, and whose heart is good. Reagan assertively declared that it was communism that would lie on the ash heap of history, not democracy, and not the United States of America. This unshakable confidence in our principles and in our vision for the world made us stronger and made us more secure. In 1987, armed with this confidence, President Reagan signed the first ever national security strategy. Today, as we approach the unveiling of the Trump administration's national security strategy, we are at a similar crossroads. Revisionist powers, Russia and China, are subverting the post-World War II political, economic, and security orders to advance their own interests at our expense and at the expense of our allies. The rogue regimes of Iran and North Korea are violating the sovereignty of their neighbors, pursuing weapons of mass destruction, and exporting terror to other nations. Jihadist terrorist organizations such as ISIS threaten all civilized people in every corner of the world. These national security challenges also require a dramatic rethinking of American foreign policy from previous decades. President Trump will soon unveil the details of his new strategy, but I can tell you now that it will focus on protecting our homeland, advancing American prosperity, preserving peace through strength, a phrase the origins of which will not be lost on this audience, and finally, enhancing American influence. Today, I would like to tell you how we are reclaiming the strategic confidence necessary for implementing this strategy through understanding in 4 areas. First, the values that define our nation. Second, the full instruments of our power. Third, the threats facing our nation. And fourth, the dynamic and competitive nature of our security environment. First, understanding the values that define our nation and who we are. President Reagan described America as a shining city upon a hill and boldly spoke truth about the sufferings of people living under fear and oppression. Today, we are reclaiming this confidence in American values. In Warsaw, the President proudly proclaimed, "We value the dignity of every human life, protect the rights of every person, and share the hope of every soul to live in freedom." In Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, the President noted that those who do not confront Islamist terrorism would be judged both by history and by God. Most recently in South Korea, the President spoke truth about the human rights violations of the North Korean regime, which he noted imprisons its people under the banner of tyranny, fascism, and oppression. He has matched this clear commitment to American values and principles with action in responding to Assad's use of the most heinous weapons on earth to commit mass murder of innocent civilians, including children. The President further demonstrated his commitment to American values with changes in our policies toward Cuba, Iran, and Venezuela. Second, understanding the full instruments of our power. President Reagan understood that diplomacy and military force were both important and equally vital tools for national power. President Trump is focused on aligning our diplomatic, economic, military, informational, intelligence, and law enforcement efforts since the first days of his administration. A great example of this has been the President's new strategy in South Asia, which he outlined for the American people in an address on August 21st of this year. After a comprehensive review of our strategic options in the region, the President decided on a new strategy grounded in the integration of all instruments of national power. We would no longer confuse activity with progress. Our military efforts and operations in the region, combined with the efforts of our partners, would focus on what brought us to Afghanistan in 2001, to deny terrorists safe havens that they can use to threaten America and threaten our allies. Third, understanding the threats and security challenges we face. President Reagan had a clear-eyed view of the national security threats facing America during his tenure. President Trump and his national security team have also clearly described the threats that emanate from revisionist powers, rogue regimes, and jihadist terrorist organizations. I'd like to acknowledge the great work of our intelligence professionals under Director Coates, Director Mike Pompeo, with Mike Pompeo here with us today. The administration's approach of principled realism also adapts a realistic view of our security environment. For this reason, we do not base national security decisions on rigid ideology, but instead on our core national interests and clearly defined objectives derived from those interests. Some threats are more obvious than others. On the recent Asia trip, the President spoke out forcefully against unfair trade and economic policies, which have disadvantaged American workers and companies. For too long, Washington turned a blind eye to cheating and exploitive practices abroad. We, in large measure, vacated the competitive economic space, and the American people paid the price. We've also been clear-eyed about the more obvious threat from North Korea's nuclear weapons and missile development. The President is committed to the total denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. He has no delusions about the North Korean dictator's intentions and recognizes the danger we all face. The era of strategic patience is over, and we will not repeat failed efforts of the past. Fourth, understanding the dynamic and competitive nature of our security environment. We must acknowledge that the international system is, above all, characterized by competition, interaction, and change. President Reagan fully understood this reality. In 1983, he signed National Security Decision Directive 75, which argued that containing and reversing Soviet influence required competing effectively on a sustained basis in all international arenas. The United States wants all nations to be strong, proud, and independent, and we want all people to have the opportunity to rise. We will compete, but competition must be fair. Our economic relationships will respect our partners' sovereignty over their economic destinies, while ensuring that American workers and American companies are not unfairly disadvantaged. With competition comes change. As his presidency neared its conclusion, President Reagan was asked about his use of the term evil empire to describe the Soviet Union. He responded, they had been talking about another time, another era. We must be willing to adjust strategy to changes in the security environment while remaining focused on our core national security interests. For example, the President's new vision for a free and open Indo-Pacific imagines a community of nations that are strong, independent, and thriving, and a future of many dreams for the people of the region. So to summarize, confronting the security challenges of today will require us to reclaim our strategic confidence. I would be grateful for your ideas on how we might better understand and apply all of our instruments of national power, understand the threats and opportunities we face, and understand and adapt to the dynamic and competitive nature of today's security environment. It is a true honor to be here with you at the Reagan Library, a living testament to the legacy of a president whose national security strategy helped make the world a safer and more humane place. As a historian, I know the stacks within these walls are full of numerous documents that record President Reagan's record and President Reagan and his team's remarkable achievements in defense and security. Our national security team recognizes that today's problems are not wholly unprecedented. We are committed to learning from the past to acquire the deep understanding essential to protect the homeland, advance American prosperity, preserve peace through strength, and enhance American influence. Thank you very much, and I'm very much looking forward to the discussion with Bret. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's great to be here. After that introduction and laying out the principles of this strategy that you say the president's going to unveil. Let's start broadly. In your mind, what is the greatest threat to national security?
Well, I would say that as we look at the time horizon associated with threats, the greatest immediate threat to the United States and to the world is the threat posed by the rogue regime in North Korea and his continued efforts to develop a long-range nuclear capability. And so it's immensely important that we work together with all of our allies, partners, everyone internationally, to convince Kim Jong-un that the continued pursuit of these capabilities is a dead end for him and his regime.
So let me get a little specific on North Korea. We're being told that the ICBM, the most recent launch, broke up on re-entry. Is North Korea having trouble on that re-entry step, and thereby right now the U.S. overall is not at threat from their ballistic missiles?
Well, it'll take some time to assess each of these missile launches, but what is clear is that every time he conducts a missile launch and nuclear test, he gets better. And whether it's a success or failure isn't as important as understanding that over the years, he's been learning from failures, improving, and thereby increasing his threat to all of us.
So has the potential of war with North Korea increased since this latest launch?
I think it's increasing every day, which means that we're in a race, really. We're in a race to be able to solve this problem, not just us, right, but the United States, all of our allies and partners. As we know, China has tremendous coercive economic power over North Korea. I mean, you can't shoot a missile without fuel, right? And so there are ways to address this problem short of armed conflict, but it is a race because he's getting closer and closer, and there's not much time left.
So is China serious about averting this conflict? I mean, are they slow walking this?
Well, you know, the initial indications were very positive. The president, as you know, very early in his presidency, met with President Xi in Mar-a-Lago. And there were some very significant results from that initial discussion about North Korea that I think represented dramatic changes potentially in China's, not only their attitude toward the problem, but also the actions that they could take. The first of these is that China agreed that this is a threat to everyone. This is a global threat. This is a threat to China. Remember, in the past, the old language would be, well, this is really a problem between the United States and North Korea. The second big change is that China was wholly committed, and President Xi affirmed this again during President Trump's recent visit to Beijing, is that China is committed to the complete denuclearization of North Korea. And remember, in the past, and still sometimes even today, you see a lapse back into the language of freeze for freeze or suspension for suspension. That's not the objective. Negotiations for negotiation's sake, not the objective. The objective is denuclearization. And that's a big shift as well. And the third big shift is China recognizes that it does have tremendous coercive economic power over North Korea. So we're asking China not to do us or anybody a favor. We're asking China to act in China's interest, as they should. And we believe increasingly that it's in China's urgent interests to do more beyond UN Security Council resolutions. As we know, we cannot rely on an international body because there are those within that body who obstruct that important work. For example, I mean, Russia just vetoed the joint investigative mechanism for the use of chemical weapons in Syria to provide more cover for the Assad regime to potentially commit further mass murder. We know that getting the sanctions that we need 100% cut off, I think, would be appropriate at this point. The president believes that of oil and fuel to North Korea may be impossible from a UN Security Council resolution, but that doesn't constrain China or any other nation from taking the bilateral actions that they can take above and beyond that.
Well, China just sent an envoy to North Korea. Does that mean that envoy failed, that they had this launch?
Well, as you know, Kim Jong-un isn't particularly cordial to anyone, right? And so, even his own people. And so I don't think it came as a surprise to Chinese leadership that this envoy was rejected and was not, didn't even didn't even have a meeting with Kim Jong-un. And so, the prospects now for any dramatic change in his behavior without some significant new actions in the form of much more severe sanctions, complete enforcement of the sanctions that are in place now, I think it's extremely unlikely for us to. He's not going to have a Grinch moment, I don't think, with his heart grows 2 sizes larger, and we see him change his behavior.
I didn't think we were going to get a Grinch reference. That's pretty good. This close to Christmas. A couple more things about North Korea, and we'll move around the world, if you would. Understanding that diplomacy is the preference here, obviously. Understanding that there are many military plans and options, there always are, for North Korea. Is there any military option that does not include the death of tens of thousands of South Koreans?
Well, we know for sure that this is what Kim Jong-un has done, right? Since 1950, right? Is held that the population of South Korea hostage, right? Every provocation, every hostile act has originated from the North. He has in the past been able to do that, obviously with large conventional capability, all these artillery pieces and rockets and so forth that exist not too far north of Seoul.
Hundreds of them.
So, right, thousands of munitions and so forth. And so there's no military course of action that comes without risk. And that's why our alliance with South Korea, with Japan, those alliances are stronger than ever. What Kim Jong-un is doing is driving us closer and closer together and coalescing the international community against Kim Jong-un. If you think about what's happened just in recent months, and I think this ought to be something maybe we ought to provide a roll-up of, but countries across the globe have taken action beyond UN Security Council resolutions. First of all, South Korea and Japan are improving their defense capabilities at breakneck speed, and they're doing that in cooperation with us. We're doing that through joint bilateral exercises and multilateral exercises in Korea and elsewhere. But also we're doing it with improved defense capabilities. But what's been striking, I think, is how many nations have expelled North Korean diplomats who have ceased all economic relations with North Korea. This is from the Philippines to Thailand to Vietnam to Sudan to Brazil to Mexico. I mean, so many examples of countries who are acting beyond the UN Security Council resolutions and supporting all of our efforts to convince Kim Jong-un that this is a dead end, diplomatically and economically.
So should Americans feel safe about going to the Winter Olympics in Seoul in February?
Yes, Americans should feel safe because we have an extraordinarily ready and capable military. And that military is getting stronger every day based on the president's priority to address what had been this big bow wave, really, of deferred military modernization. He's strengthening all of our services and their capabilities, and I think that's pretty apparent.
Sure, but did you sign off on the U.S. team being a part of that Olympics, the White House or the NSC?
I don't even know if there's a process for doing that, but I'm certain that we would. And
I guess the question is,
the president assured President Moon just last week that there'll be a strong presidential delegation. I'll tell you one of the great things about going to South Korea is what you get to see is the stark contrast between two systems. And you see, look at South Korea in 1953, a country ravaged by decades of war, no natural resources, a population that undereducated, largely illiterate because of the war that they had been under. You had, frankly, a corrupt government, and a hostile neighbor. It looked pretty bleak. Look at South Korea now. What a thriving country, fifth largest economy in Asia. Then just go a few miles north across the 38th parallel and look at the hell that is North Korea. And you see today a dramatic contrast, even probably more dramatic than that which existed across the walls and fences that divided Eastern and Western Europe during the Cold War.
It's a dangerous time. We'll bounce around. You mentioned Syria, has cooperating with Russia in Syria cemented Bashar al-Assad in power?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think that de facto, Bashar al-Assad, to the great disappointment of of us and the Syrian people, is in power. And so what's needed is a political transition that allows all Syrians to have a say in the future nature of that government so they can get out of this horrible humanitarian crisis. How can Assad be part of that? It's really hard to imagine, right? Somebody who has committed mass murder of his own people. How does that work? We're going to ask the Syrian population to accept him? Millions of refugees and displaced people, murdered people, imprisoned and tortured people, families all of whom have, almost every family's lost someone based on the brutality of this regime and its interaction with the other brutal enemies that we're fighting on that territory, ISIS and al-Nusra and other groups. So what's needed in Syria is a consolidation of gains over ISIS and a consolidation in such a way that it can bridge into a political process that can deliver enduring security. What Syria has become is a destructive cycle of sectarian violence. That who takes advantage of that? These Islamist terrorist organizations like Daesh or ISIS and Al-Qaeda related groups like Nusra, and the Iranians. And what the Iranians have done across the greater Middle East is fuel and accelerate these cycles of violence so that they can take advantage of these chaotic environments, take advantage of weak states to make them dependent on them for support.
So how can the U.S. roll back Iran's gains in the Middle East then?
Well, by a comprehensive strategy. And I think it's fair to say that in recent years, in maybe what we can say, certainly in retrospect, was an unrealistically hopeful strategy that, given a nuclear deal, what the president has called the worst deal ever, that deal would result in an Iran that would integrate more effectively in the region, that would change its behavior. But you know what's happened? The exact opposite has happened. And I think the focus on trying to accommodate Iran has empowered Iran across the whole region. And so when the president says he's inherited a mess, that mess, I think, is in North Korea, but it's also in the greater Middle East, where we have to address what is a growing Iranian capability and an ability to use proxies, militias, terrorist organizations to advance their hegemonic aims in the region. And what they're in the middle of doing now is using a sophisticated campaign of subversion in Iraq and a continued support for Assad. About 80% of Assad's fighters are Iranian proxies in Syria, to establish this kind of land bridge over into the Mediterranean. And so what we face is the prospect of Iran having a proxy army on the borders of Israel. What we see is the weaponization of Iran's network in Yemen, in southern Lebanon. They're trying to do it in Syria with these long-range missiles, and they're increasing the threat that Iran poses to the whole region through this Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps and their proxies. So what we have in place now is a comprehensive strategy for Iran, and denying Iran all paths to a nuclear weapon is one part of that strategy. Countering Iran's destabilizing behavior is another critical part of that strategy. And so I think you've seen some significant changes in how we're working with allies and partners in the region to affect that.
Given the threats, especially from North Korea and Iran that we just talked about, why do you think there is no bipartisan urgency to significantly increase defense spending?
Well, I think there should be. The president thinks that there should be, and it's something the president is working on urgently now. So there are some dramatic examples of why we need an end to the defense sequester, why we need a higher degree of predictability in the defense budget. As I mentioned, there's a huge bow wave of deferred modernization, but also each of our services aren't big enough. I mean, look at what the president said during the campaign. He was very clear on what we had to do in the area of modernization and what we had to do to make sure that our armed forces had the depth, those capabilities, and sufficient scale, right, to deal with these crises, to protect our security and our interests.
But General, you know, the criticism up on Capitol Hill is that the Hawks were a little bit disappointed with the number that they got from the president and you all from the budget.
Yeah. Well, what the president has done is dramatically increased defense spending to address the most egregious gaps. And this is the beginning. This is the beginning of a recovery in military capabilities and in military capacity, depth in those forces. Now, what Secretary Mattis has prioritized initially is the first thing you've got to do is make sure the forces you have are ready. And so a lot of resources have gone into that now. But what's really needed is our new capabilities to deal with our adversaries who've watched us closely. And while we cut back on modernization, they developed kind of a narrow range of capabilities, but capabilities that threaten what used to be our ability to overmatch our enemies. Now, we are still extraordinarily capable. If we go to a fight, it's not going to be a fair fight for any enemy who takes us on. But we have to invest now to ensure we maintain that overmatch.
Congress overwhelmingly approved sanctions against Russia in July. It's been a slow process to see those implemented. Yeah. Why?
Well, you know, I always think that you can get the instant sanction. You know, you just go to the Treasury and say, hey, sanction, and it happens. But I've learned the process now. It takes some time to make sure we do it right, to make sure we sanction the right entities. So the State Department has released its guidance. Treasury, some of the most overworked people in our government are in our awesome Treasury Department, who do the hard analytical work, who ensure that we can meet the threshold for in placing these sanctions. But I'll tell you, there's no holding back on it. But if you think about it, sanctions are relevant to countering Russia's destabilizing behavior, and we're moving out on that as fast as we can. But it's also to increase the economic isolation and pressure on the North Korean regime. It's also to sanction Iran's behavior associated with their missile development in violation of UN Security Council resolutions, and to sanction their behavior based on their support for terrorist organizations and their proxies. If you look at Venezuela, right, and the victimization of the Venezuelan people, and doing everything we can in support with our allies and partners to communicate to Maduro that he has to restore his citizens' constitutional rights, that has a lot to do with sanctions. So there's nobody taking any days off these days in the Treasury Department.
In the campaign, arming Ukrainians was part of the pitch. Is that still the policy of the administration?
Yes, and what we're continuing to do is strengthen Ukrainian defensive capabilities. And as everybody knows, that's been based on non-lethal assistance. But you know, the Ukrainians are very capable. And you know, I saw General John Abizaid here, who's had a big role in this. The Ukrainians are embarked on a significant governmental reform effort, but also a military reform effort. And I think it would be extremely difficult for Russian proxies, Russia, to be able to make significant gains if they were to extend the territory that they're controlling after their invasion of Ukraine.
It's a dangerous world, and you look around the world, and there are a ton of hot spots. This next question is politically sensitive, but you said everything was open when we started this thing. Does an event like the indictment of your predecessor carry some kind of foreign policy or national security impact? In other words, do foreign allies get rattled by it? Do adversaries get emboldened by it? Does it somehow constrain the Trump administration foreign policy?
No, you know, I've seen no evidence of the investigation in any way impeding the important work that we're doing. So what we're endeavoring to do is to regain our strategic focus. And so what the president asked us to do in the National Security Council is devolve responsibilities and authorities and decision-making back to the departments and agencies who have to execute those policies. And we've done that. And with all that time that we've saved, mulling about tactical details, we've established a very strong foundation of strategy, clearly articulated objectives for the main national security challenges we're facing. Now, one of those challenges is Russia. And what we're endeavoring to do with Russia is three things. We need to counter Russia's destabilizing behavior that we saw really grow significantly in the last several years, right? You can go back to the denial of service attacks in Estonia in 2007, invasion of Georgia 2008, invasion of Ukraine, intervention on the side of the Assad regime in Syria. You could just go on and on. There's a disturbing pattern. And then, of course, you have the subversion of democracies broadly in the West. Europe has suffered in particular from this. You saw Russian hands in the Catalonia independence referendum. You're starting to see Russia active in Mexico and well in advance of the Mexican election. So what we've been focused on is the three things we have to do with Russia: counter their destabilizing behavior, including this so-called hybrid warfare or new generation warfare, where they attempt to use a sophisticated strategy of subversion, but really disinformation and propaganda to polarize communities and affect our confidence. I gave this talk about strategic confidence. It's really an element of that. We should, part of reclaiming our strategic confidence is having confidence in what unifies us as Americans. And so it would be great if every time we talk about what divides us, we also at least give equal time to what unites us as Americans. So we want to confront Russia's destabilizing behavior. We want to deter conflict with Russia, right? It wouldn't be in anybody's interest to have a large-scale conflict with Russia. And the third thing, though, we need to do is try to find areas of cooperation with Russia. So our Russia policy is very practically focused now and forward-looking to do those three things.
So you don't think your counterparts around the world were rattled by yesterday?
No, I don't think so. I mean, we're in very close contact. There's sort of a national security advisors support group, that we have. We get together periodically at conferences, and we're always on the phone with each other. And there's tremendous confidence. I think there's more confidence in the United States, frankly. I think there's a sense that we are re-engaging in areas where we had largely disengaged. I mean, you might remember a Foreign Affairs article maybe 3 years ago or so. It sort of celebrated the post-American Middle East as if this was a triumph. Well, how's that working out, right? What we've endeavored to do is to engage in a meaningful way with allies and partners to break this horrible cycle of sectarian violence, to have the enduring defeat of ISIS. We have now, with our allies and partners, defeated ISIS in 95% of the so-called caliphate in Syria and Iraq. There's a lot to celebrate in what's going on. I mean, the situation is in the Middle East right now. It's very tenuous. Yemen, horrible humanitarian crisis there. We're working very hard to address that, to convince others that they have to address that as a matter of urgency. But in general, U.S. re-engagement in that region and in other areas has been welcomed and I think has been encouraging.
General McMaster, thank you for your candid remarks. Thank you for your service to the country, sir.
Thank you, Brett. What a privilege to be with you and everyone. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, enjoy the rest of the forum.